We welcome you and call to order our meeting of today, Wednesday, January the 30th. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance and followed by a safety minute from Dave Garris. If you'd stand and join me in doing so.
There it is.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just three of the items that we want to bring before you today. It was interesting that our safety message last Friday was, are you prepared for a power outage in severe weather? So as the Midwest is getting minus 50-degree weather, heat and light are important. Check your flashlights, have sufficient heating fuel. I just want to let you know that most of our facilities at UTA do have a backup generator that would provide some power for us for the vital systems and heat for a short period of time. But just consciously for your own personal residence, if you did lose power, as we lost our furnace, was not power, what do you do to stay warm and stay healthy? Message we've received, again, just some good stories that we get. This is from a supervisor down in Tim who just wrote an email to Chief Ross, who's in the back of the room. Just want to express thanks to all of you who are involved in providing the police patrol functions and the regular bus service and Front Runner and the UVX system in Timpanogos. I have received very positive feedback from our customers that the police presence has made a huge positive impact in the county, and the assigned patrol officers are an absolute joy to work with. So again, our presence is always felt and appreciated. And last thing I just want to bring to your attention is on a lot of our wristbands and the railroad safety pins that we wear, it is Operation Lifesaver, which is a national railroad safety organization. The national conference is actually going on, excuse me, in West Valley this week. So we have all the state coordinators from 46 of the states here, and it is Utah is recognized frequently as one of the best systems and best best programs in the U.S. So it's nice to have all of them here this week. That's it. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. We'll next go to our public comment period. And Bob, do we have any that
we do not have any public comment today.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Next, I'll entertain a motion. First of all, we welcome our newest member, Kent Millington. Thank you, Kent, and nice to be here. Nice to have you here.
Good to be here.
So we'll just give you the reminder that when you go to talk, that little button on the bottom has to be pushed, or whoever's doing the minutes will curse your name. So next, I'll entertain a motion to approve our minutes from January the 23rd.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we approve the minutes as written and submitted.
I'll second.
Well, this is kind of novelty. A joyous moment. Okay. Seeing no other discussion, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion passes. We have our Executive Director, Steve Meyer, on the phone with us. And Steve, do you have anything on the agency report? Welcome, and do you have anything on the agency report?
Good morning. A few items for you this morning. UTA was our participant in the American Dream Challenge, and this was a nationwide effort, and we were teamed with UTA, UDOT, and Salt Lake City with a project proposal for mobility as a service, which would have developed an app to simplify transportation choices, combining transit, rideshare, and other transportation modes. That team was a finalist from Utah, one of three teams that went to Phoenix to compete. Unfortunately, we weren't selected as the winner, but congratulations to that team. It's a great project, and I think we'll continue to look for ways to make that happen. And the team did a great job presenting and advocating for that project. Another item, FTA is back in business with the rest of the federal government. Talked to the regional administrator yesterday. They are working over this next 3-week period to get caught up and advance any work that we had on hold. They are talking about in Washington advancing the award of any grants that are outstanding. So we should potentially hear on a couple of grant applications that we've made. Work on the federal fiscal year 2020 budget has been delayed because of the shutdown. We would normally be seeing a list of potential projects that had made the list for 2020. So we'll be anxiously watching and participating with FTA, advocating the big project we had moving forward was the Ogden BRT project. So we'll be watching for that to see if that gets included in that funding package for 2020. That's my report for this morning. Thank you, Chair.
Any questions for Steve?
Steve, it's more like a comment. I just wanted to say that I had the opportunity to attend the American Dream Challenge. For the state of Utah, the finalists were at the University of Utah, and I was so excited and so impressed with what they came up with conceptually. I think that this is going to be a great opportunity down the road. I keep looking at Steve like he's there, so I just realized I'm looking at just the microphone. So, but anyway, it was just an amazing event and such an opportunity to partner and show some of the thoughts. I think specifically it worked on the connecting transit with the first and last mile solutions, and so great job. I wanted to say again. So thank you so much. Another quick comment I wanted to make is on the Ogden BRT. I did actually have questions on that yesterday or the other day from some of our Weber County people, and so I'm excited to see that that the government is now opened, and hopefully that delay won't be too long. They'll get up to speed quickly. So thanks.
Ken, looks like Ken.
Yes, Steve, I have a couple of questions. You mentioned we have a couple of grants that are being that have been submitted and are being considered. What are they, and what are the size of those grants? Yeah,
those are good questions. And what I'd like to do next week is just give you an overall grant application update and overall status. I don't have those with me this morning. But,
all right, thank you. We'll look for that next week.
Steve, along the line of Beth's comments on sort of this app that they were working on, is there a vehicle for that to sort of, regardless of where it's placed in the competition, is there a vehicle or a mechanism where that effort could continue, either with us or with the university or some other entity or UDOT?
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll continue to talk within the group, and I think we have a pretty good scope now, and we understand the steps that we would take to move forward if we'd had the grant. Now let's look for opportunities, other funding opportunities to make that happen.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you for that report. We'll next go to some discussion items, and let's see. Do we have who you need?
So Brian Baker reports he's been on the other side of the train for 15 minutes, and if we could move past his item to a different
just
one.
text back and say there's 400 south.
It sounds like he's trapped, though. He's not sure he can get out.
Oh,
yeah.
That's okay. Well, we're gonna go then if we can, because we also know he has a commitment up on the Hill to our government relations update with Matt Sybil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to see all three of you here this morning. So, good morning. I've asked Andrea Packer if it's okay to come up with me, and in a minute, we want to talk in more detail about Transit Day on the Hill. Before we get into that, though, perhaps I can just give a brief overview of kind of where we're at session-wise. It's day 3, so there's only 42 to go, right? I wanted to say in general terms, so tax modernization, Medicaid expansion, and hate crimes are the 3 topics that seem to be consuming so far and probably will throughout the rest of the session. And that's probably okay with us, right? I wanted to say, too, we're working very closely with the sponsors of SB 72. This is the small cleanup bill from SB 136 last year. It's 145 pages of cleanup. But we've been meeting with the sponsors, and there's a few changes there that we want to see that impact us at UTA. Most of those changes are technical in nature, and most of them relate to the local option sales tax for the non-UTA portion of that sales tax. We're continuing to meet with new members of the House and Senate Transportation. You've been involved with many of those meetings. There are about 10 new members. So we'll continue to have those over the next week or two. I wanted to also thank Bob and Andrea and their teams. We have an updated budget in brief now, and we'll get copies of this to you. And it has the updated governance information in here, so you're all three shown in the right way. In fact, I don't know if you've seen it. Do you mind bringing them up to the? We have handouts.
Michelle was
for
kind
everybody.
enough to bring them around last
Oh,
evening.
excellent! Thank you. Yeah,
So
Michelle is always.
And we're excited about them.
Those
I think
things,
they'll be a good addition.
So let's transition for a moment, if it's okay, and talk about Transit Day on the Hill. Just a tiny bit of history. So this started about 3 years ago. We annually try to meet with all of the transit providers from around the state, and there are 5 other providers. So Cache Valley Transit, Park City, Vernal in the Uinta Basin, Cedar City, and then St. George. And St. George is called SunTrans. And on top of that, we have rural transit through UDOT, and then the Navajo Nation actually has their own transit system. So we at UTA have been meeting with those groups for years, coordinating legislative topics. And about 3 years ago, we said to ourselves, why don't we have an event during the legislative session to really showcase what we do with our transit properties? And so that kind of spawned Transit Day on the Hill. We started bringing our respective buses up to the Capitol, and it's hard to miss a 40-foot bus when they're piled together on the South Plaza, and it got a lot of attention and a lot of media exposure, and we kind of ran with it. And the last couple of years, it's gotten bigger, and we've had generally really good participation from each of the transit providers. And so we're going to do it again this year. And so next Wednesday, a week from today, February 6th, is Transit Day on the Hill. And I'm going to let Andrew talk about it in more detail, but generally we've got a 3-hour window. So right after your board meeting, we'll get you up to the South Plaza, and from 11 a.m. to about 2 p.m., we will have one of our trolley buses up there. There'll be buses from several of the other transit properties. Park City is extremely busy with things like the film festival, Sundance, thank you. But they're going to try and bring one of their buses down. And it's a great opportunity for us as an agency to really just show the value and the impact of what we do each and every day at UTA, plus the other entities as well. So that kind of broadly overviews it. And Andrea and her team have been doing a great deal of planning. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of coordination. So Andrea's group, Michelle, has been working with the Capitol folks. They tend to care about things like buses, too many buses being in one area that might collapse the roof below. There's actually things below the South Plaza. So there's a ton of details to work through, as you can imagine. I'll let Andrea talk about it, but it would be great to have all three of you engaged with this and really helping promote it and be a part of it. Andrea?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. So as far as some of the activities and communications that we have planned, Matt and Michelle have been working on getting the vehicles up there and coordinating some of those logistics. We will be on the western side of the plaza, just at the bottom of the steps. This happened to us last year, but it is food truck day up on the hill, so they tend to get the right side or the east side of the plaza. So we'll probably be to the left. We are trying to coordinate maybe a short program with some remarks from our partners or maybe some legislators at some point during that 3-hour window, but we're still finalizing those details and hope to have that wrapped up by the end of the week. As far as communications and promoting it, we are creating kind of an evite that we can send out to our employees and to our elected officials and stakeholders, particularly the legislators who we invite to come out at some point in that window and see the vehicles and talk with staff and ask questions about transit or the vehicles that are out there. Last year we had the UVX bus out there, so we were showcasing that and got a lot of enthusiasm. So we are planning to send out the invitations starting tomorrow and Friday, just to kind of build awareness. And then on Monday, we will focus more on media relations and social media. So we will be sending out media advisories or press releases as we finalize the program of speakers and the timing. And then we will do typical social media with probably, sometimes we do a blog post in advance, and then oftentimes we'll do one after the fact where we can get some of the comments from the remarks as well as photos of the event. And so those activities will happen Monday and Tuesday and through Wednesday of next week until the event. So we're working hard on getting the word out and making it really successful again this year.
Questions? Yeah.
Andrea, I just had a question, and Matt maybe as well. So as I understand it, we're getting the trolley, which I'm really excited about. I think that'll be a great addition. What other vehicles are we getting out there? Is there an electric bus I heard or something like that?
So,
or is that defined yet?
Yeah, there may be as many as 2 electric buses. So, and our folks, we're actually so UTA is in the process of receiving 3 fully electric buses from a manufacturer called New Flyer. And once they arrive, we have to get them licensed and to be able to drive them on a road and get them certified and so forth. So we may have one of those up there. Park City Transit, they would bring down one of their electric buses if they're able to bring a vehicle down. So we're not quite sure yet on that, but we may have two electric vehicles up there, plus the trolley. And then SunTran plans on bringing a vehicle up, and Cache Valley Transit, one of their buses down from Logan.
Is there, Andrea or Matt, is there something, as folks are going through the buses, or, is there something, a takeaway, like, is there something that we're giving them with some just sort of, with information on it about the systems, about who's carrying what? And I just didn't know if there's anything coordinated between the.
Yeah, we do typically coordinate some, handouts or information. We also have various, partners there too as well who can give comments and talk with legislators directly. Okay. So with last year with the UVX bus, we did, have some fact sheets and fold out flyers about the service that was coming and information about the bus. The trolley bus, is new and not as well known outside of, Davis or Weber County. So we want to really showcase that and have information about it. But a lot of the benefit we get is just from the one-on-one interaction as legislators and others come out and ask questions and, and wants more specifics about the vehicle or the service. Yeah. Or the routes. And so even last year we had partners like Tom Carter from UCare who was up there. And so we just, as we talk about our new technologies, we try to have the right people there as well as printed information. And
then I'll just quickly add, so we, Laura Hansen's group and then Mary DiLoretto's group have been very helpful. They've got some great information about the positive air quality impacts of transit. So there's some brochures that we can hand out, talk to lawmakers and the public about. And then Mary DiLoretto's group has some really effective one-pagers that overview things like transit connections potentially to Point of the Mountain, future of Frontrunner, those kinds of initiatives that people, they want to hear about. So we'll have information that we can hand out and engage on.
Yeah, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, Andrea, are the other 4 agencies helping you contact their representatives from their particular areas with these emails and contacts to get the their participation?
Yeah, we do coordinate with them to kind of reinforce or repeat the information. We do have a pretty comprehensive list of all the elected officials in our service area, but then we want to extend it to all legislators even out of our service area. So we do work on, here's kind of a general information or invitation. Please forward it to your staffs or to other stakeholders in your community that you feel are important. And so they're very supportive in helping us spread the word.
Add anything else on your?
That's all I had, unless you had any other questions. Thank you.
I think that's probably good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It looks like the train has moved, and you found. I got here. I went around on 400. Okay, good. We're always grateful for those of us who live on the west side for viaducts. They had a little bit of normalcy. So we appreciate you being here. We have Brian Baker from Zions Bank Public Finance and Bob Biles to talk about bonds, and then an update on bond ratings.
Yeah, so I'll do a little lead in, and then Brian will make the presentation. I want to make sure you understand that Brian is your financial advisor. We went through a process, it's been 2 years ago now, to select the financial advisor for UTA. The board was involved in that particular decisions. So even though I work closely with Brian, he works closely with us, he's really your financial advisor. And so he's going to be making the presentation today. So we're here really to talk about a couple of things, just to give an overview of the bonds and where we're at and some things that have changed. And then to talk about Standard & Poor's and ratings criteria changes and how that might affect UTA. So with that, Brian?
Grateful to be here with you, and welcome. Fun to be with the new commissioners, and look forward to getting to know you and working with you all. We wanted to kind of look at from a high level where UTA is from a debt perspective, what is pledged to the repayment of the bonds that you have outstanding, what isn't pledged, what the numbers look like, and so that'll give you kind of some background, and hopefully this will be interactive. If you have questions, and we'd be happy to answer them and just kind of increase your understanding and background information on where UTA is from a debt and from a bonding perspective, and what the pluses and minuses of your current position are, and certainly debt has been a tool that the authority has used over the years to be able to construct all of the projects that the public is now benefiting from. And there were times in the past when sales tax would drop and there would be financial difficulty, and the question was, well, we could slow down the construction on these projects, and the board, and not just the board, because the board was appointed by stakeholders from all of the various counties, the stakeholders would come back and say, we want these projects, we'd like to get these projects built. And that's kind of how the genesis of UTA's bonding program that led us to where we are now. But I'd love to start just the first page. This shows the current local sales taxes that UTA receives, and this goes back and details each of them, and they've been changed over the years. But you can see on the far right the various current contribution levels from the different counties and entities that are paying taxes to Utah Transit Authority. Salt Lake and Utah County have both enacted the 2218 tax, which was kind of the Prop 1 tax, and under this new format, UTA will begin receiving that 0.1% from the far right column starting on July 1 of 2019. The legislature when they enacted the 2218 tax, they also said you can put on another quarter-cent of 2219 tax that cannot be put on unless the county has already decided to put the 2218 tax in place. So both Utah County and Salt Lake County in the future will have the option of looking, and it's actually not that far down the road. It's starting in the next year, where they would have the option of looking at whether they wanted to put that additional 2219 tax on that has been authorized but has not been put in place yet.
And we should also mention that the 2217 tax for Tooele was just put in place. And we just started receiving those. We've seen that in our monthly sales tax report for Tooele.
Can I ask a quick question? You mentioned Tooele, but Tooele is not mentioned in here in terms of it being already pledged against a bond. So that revenue, because it's just coming in, is not pledged either. Is that correct?
That should be true.
And of all of the taxes that are listed up there, the only one that is currently not pledged to the outstanding sales tax revenue bonds that the authority has is the far right column. So the Prop 1 taxes and the 2218 tax is not pledged to any of the outstanding indebtedness that the authority has. And that's not a problem, and it also gives the authority some flexibility in the future in terms of programming and what they want to use those dollars for, working with the counties and stakeholders. But also, there's theoretically another source of collateral in the future if it was ever needed. It's currently not needed, and I don't know that it's anticipated that you would need that ever to have the capacity to bond for anything that you needed to bond for. The following page gives you an idea of where the sales taxes have come from historically. So this shows the 6 counties that contribute sales taxes to the Utah Transit Authority, and you can kind of see year over year the growth and relative amounts of where those dollars come from. So for the 2017 fiscal year, and again, we don't have final 2018 numbers yet, but of the almost $57 million that was received, about 163 million of that came from Salt Lake County, 43 million from Utah County, and you can see so that kind of gives you an understanding of where those dollars are coming from. As you know, the authority does a regular equity analysis to kind of ensure that each of those stakeholders feel that their dollars are being used to support the source that they're coming from. In that table, also there are periodically some very large increases, especially going back and sometimes those were where additional taxes were put in place, and so as new taxes were put online, we might have a large bump, particularly going actually back before this table when you had some of the new full quarter cents come on. You'd have a 36% increase in certain counties in 1 year that was specifically related to a new tax that had not been in place previously.
You don't have the 2018 numbers final, but do you have any estimate of where they would stack up against the 257 million?
So these are pledged taxes. I know I've made an estimate for all of our sales taxes, around 284 million, but I'd have to take the pledged taxes out. That's about around 10 million round numbers. So we should be around 270, 274.
The following page shows in a histogram chart with more colors than you might want to look at. But this is every single outstanding debt issue or bond financing that the Utah Transit Authority has. And you have bonds that are issued on a senior lien and bonds that are issued on a subordinate lien, which have slightly different legal covenants. But as the authority looked at each bond issue, you'd look at it on an aggregate basis, with the intention being that you're going to repay all of the debt no matter what, whether it's senior or subordinate. You can also see the authority historically issued 30-year bonds. Most of the projects that you build, we hope, are around for 50 to 100 years. But the bonds were financed over a 30-year period, and you can see that because there has been no large issuance of new money bonding in the last 8 years or so. We kind of left the end of that chart out there. That chart goes out 30 years, but you can see that during the large building programs of the 2000s, there was new debt being put out in the 30-year range, and that hasn't been done in 7 years. So you have a large hole there at the back that will continue to shorten as the authority moves forward without issuing new 30-year debt. So that creates. It demonstrates that you're shortening the average maturity of the bonds that are outstanding, and then periodically when people will ask about the capacity of the Utah Transit Authority to borrow, you can see that your debt just sort of drops off a cliff at the end there. And so theoretically, if the authority ever needed to, that could be looked at as places where you have capacity, although I know that's not the anticipation at this time.
Brian, and I realized at the time, in the heart of the recession, and cash flow was clearly a challenge. How typical was 30-year debt for transit agencies? And I realize you're only dealing with us here, probably locally, but as you go out to the market, was that an unusual type of issuance? Is that not uncommon?
30 years is pretty much the standard for transit agencies. There are, the state of Utah generally doesn't issue debt past 15 years. But if you look at New York MTA and BART and Denver Rapid Transit and Dallas, a lot of the comparables that we would look at, you see 30 years. And in some case, when they had financial strain, some of those entities went out to 40 years. Because the idea would be with the debt issuances that you're looking to somewhat match up the useful life of the project with those who are paying for it. And so if you finance something over a 30-year period that you expect to last 40, 50, 60 years, that's not seen as out of place. And certainly we'd never contemplated going past 30 years, but there were others who did nationally on the transit side.
And if you look at the 2033 through 36, near the top, there's a little bit darker blue. It's not the darkest blue, but the medium blue. That's the 2018 bond issue, and we set the maximum maturity of that of 2036. Part of that's based upon the life of the assets. We have to do a calculation and show to our bond counsel that the bond issue is less than the expected average life of the assets that we're borrowing for. And so we intentionally kept that at 2036. And all the refundings we've done, we've never extended the maturity, at least the time I've been here.
Yeah, that's correct.
We haven't extended the maturity on any of those.
So in that 2018 issue, if I'm looking at your bar chart, the repayment portion of that is really backloaded. Am I looking at that correctly? I mean,
yes, it is.
Looks like you're mostly paying interest for.
Sure. So part of what you do with a chart like this, as you're looking at issuing bonds, is you're wanting to get more level it out. So we had this dip in 2033 through 36 that we just filled in and didn't increase our debt service from the 2029 through 2032 area.
Just for informationally, when the rating agencies look at the coverage that the Utah Transit Authority has on their debt, so they're looking at how secure their debt is, they don't look at the revenue you had this year against the debt service payment you had this year. They look at the revenue you had this year that's already in the bank versus what your maximum annual debt service is. And so so on this chart, they'd go look out at 2032 and say, okay, that's your maximum. The highest number that you pay is in 2032. And so we're going to take the last 12 months revenue and measure it against that to determine whether we think you have the financial wherewithal to meet those obligations both now and in the future. Additionally, on that sheet, you will see two lines up above the bar chart. The red line is the estimated, actually that's the actual last 12 months revenues that the Utah Transit Authority has received. And so that's not the fiscal 17 or the fiscal 18. It's in fact going through October of 2018 because those were the amounts that we had at the time. And then that yellow line represents 1.2 times coverage. And on your subordinate debt, that is you can't issue bonds that would take you below 1.2 times coverage on the subordinate debt. We don't anticipate you ever getting close to that again in the future. But that theoretically, if someone was looking at capacity, those bars on the histogram could go up to that yellow line, and you could fill debt in that high. But that's not recommended and not something you're planning to do. But it gives you a sense for the comfort level that you should have based on your bond covenants, because you have significant distance between even your maximum annual debt service level and the level of current sales tax receipts.
And Brian, just really quick, sorry, back to that one. So what just so that I can understand it and restate this, what you're saying basically is that the bonding agencies that look at the previous 12 months to do an aggregate of your revenue, what they're saying is that if it ever got to the 1.2%, then that would be considered a red flag for them. Is that
absolutely? There are a couple of ways to look at it. One, the 1.2 is a legal covenant called an additional bonds test, meaning that you cannot issue bonds that would take any of those histogram lines up above that 1.2. Like you legally cannot do it. But also, the further away you get from that line, meaning the higher your number is over 1.2 times, the more comfortable they are with your ability to not be swallowing up all of your sales tax receipts in debt payments and your ability to continue to maintain and operate the system. Obviously, they look at the fact that the sales tax pledge is a gross pledge. So theoretically, the bondholders will get paid no matter what, but they're also very concerned about wanting to make sure that we run and maintain the type of system that we've told all of our stakeholders that we have the capacity and ability to do.
Thank you.
So you can see this shows, so you have a senior coverage level and you have a subordinate coverage level. Now the senior coverage just simply looks at those bonds that were issued on the senior lien. And that's kind of an interesting, you know, the histogram we saw on the last chart, the senior debt doesn't match up. You know, it's not a straight even line. It's kind of a little bit chunky. But you can see that in 2011, when we went to issue bonds, your additional bonds test on senior debt was 2 times, meaning you needed to be able to cover the debt payment with more than 200% of revenues, and we could not have done that at the time, based on where our sales tax revenues were and based on where the level of debt service payments were. And so you can see the numbers there, 1.9 coverage on the senior and 1.2 on the subordinate. And then since that time, coverage levels have improved, you know, dramatically, and to such a point where rating reports at the time around 2010, 2011 worried about the authority being close to those levels, close to those numbers. And so, you know, now the rating reports talk about improving debt service coverage that is expected to continue to improve given the absence of a gigantic long-term bonding. You know, we've indicated to them that the revenues that we currently had pledged were to address the Frontlines 2015 projects, that those projects were now completed, and that other than, you know, some smaller types of issuances, that there was no long-term, you know, we've got $2 billion that we want to issue against this revenue right now. And so that makes them feel increasingly comfortable that we've kind of got the projects built and should be able to address and maintain and operate them with the increasing level of sales tax we've seen.
And what I remember is we were at 1.1 debt service coverage for the subordinate, and we increased that about 3 years ago,
Yep.
3 to 4 years ago. So we made our covenants more restrictive just a few years ago.
And again, looking at that chart and you know, looking at that and thinking to yourselves, what would it take for you to bond up to the 1.2 times? I think nobody has any anticipation we'd ever get close to that. So possibly down the road, the authority could consider making that even more restrictive, because you want to still have the flexibility to do what you need to do, but making it more restrictive indicates to the rating agencies we have no intention of going there, and we can tell them that, but putting it into a legal covenant makes it you know, even more positive in their regard. So this is the authority several years ago, 20, you know the date?
I think it was 2012.
Okay. The authority established what was called the Debt Service Reserve and Rate Stabilization Fund, and part of that was, at the time, the authority had a small amount of variable rate debt, and for the purposes of budgeting, to forecast how to make sure we didn't under budget for variable rate debt payments, we budgeted at 3.6%. But as you recall, for a lot of that time period, the interest rate we were paying was just barely over 0. And so there was huge savings relative to the budget. You know, the budget was 3.6%, but even including the remarketing costs and the letter of credit fee that went along with it, you're paying well less than 1%. And so the CFO looked at a way to capture that savings and save it against times when it might be needed. And so they continued to budget at that 3.6%, but they took the amount of money that was not needed for those interest payments and put that towards this rate stabilization fund, also contributing any savings from refinancing debt. So in 2015, the authority did about an $865 million refinancing of a lot of debt that was issued in 2007 and 2008 to fund the Frontlines 2015 projects, locked in over $100 million in savings. And then that savings and the budgeting of that savings is reflected in this chart in the growth of the debt rate stabilization reserve. And so currently, the authority has about that $47 million at the end of 2018, and that numbers will grow considerably because a lot of the savings that was captured on that bond refinancing comes into play in the next couple of years. And so that gives you flexibility. It also, when we talk to the rating agencies, they'll talk about debt service reserve accounts, again, that are literally given to the trustee on the bonds, and that these are not in that category, but then other pockets of reserves that the authority has. And we'll show them this chart, and they'll say, wow, that's really impressive that you're taking the savings on those bonds and essentially setting them aside with the intended use of either paying down debt early or redeeming bonds when needed, or it's obviously any other use of the board at your discretion.
And we'll have a discussion about reserves next week, so we'll talk more in depth next week about this one.
But it puts you in a nice position where in a couple of years you'll have some 2012 bonds that you could pay off with cash, or you could use the money for other purposes and keep it as a reserve. It's like I tell my kids with their allowance, once you spend it, you spent it on one thing, but as long as you have cash, that's a pretty good thing, and it leaves you with options and flexibility, and certainly the rating agencies appreciate that.
Brian, that 2012 debt, what's sort of, do you know the interest rate? I mean, the blended interest rate of that issuance?
It was a little over 4%, and importantly, there's the coupon and the yields, and most of those bonds were issued with 5% coupons. And so in the environment that we're in now, once they become eligible to be called or paid off, it's something that would make sense. And the good news is you would have the cash to pay them off with cash if you wanted to, or you could refinance them and lock in savings by issuing new debt that simply replaces the higher interest debt with lower interest debt. So if you did it that way, you'd still have this cash as a reserve on an ongoing basis.
So I anticipate there'll be a lot of analysis taking place in 2021 to give to the board to think about your options and how you might use these funds.
So on the following slide, this just gives a picture of the Utah Transit Authority's debt portfolio as of January 1, 2019. You can see there is no inconsequential amount of debt there. I mean, you're a little over $2.1 billion. The senior debt and the subordinated debt, you can imagine, because the covenants are slightly less restrictive on the subordinated debt. If you were to go out into the market today and issue bonds, if you issued subordinated debt instead of senior debt, you'd probably pay 0.1 to 0.2% higher rates because the covenants are a little bit less restrictive. But over time, there have been times in the market where the difference between the senior and the subordinated rates was almost zero. And then there have been times where it kind of gaps out when there's a real focus on credit quality, and you find a real, you might be up to 0.4, 0.5% difference in the rates between those two. But you have significant borrowing capacity under both the subordinated lien and the senior lien, levels of capacity that we don't imagine you ever needing to tap into. And so we just look at whenever you needed to issue debt in the future, we'd have a conversation about which one it made sense to use and why, considering a number of things, including interest rate, credit ratings, and future flexibility. So these are your current bond ratings, and it's been quite entertaining is not the right word, but it's very interesting to watch the status of UTA's credit ratings over the years. I think it was in 2007 when UTA was given the AAA rating by Standard & Poor's, and their analysis basically at the time, and for municipal advisor, we work with a lot of clients, cities and counties in the state of Utah, and those that issue sales tax bonds. We would invariably tell them the credit rating agency you want to use is Standard & Poor's, because they take the most lenient look at the quality of credit. They look at a city and they say, well, yes, you might be able to borrow a lot against your sales tax, but we also know you have to use your sales tax to operate your city, that all of your operations are paid for by sales tax. So we understand as a credit rating agency, you're not going to actually bond down to a place that would make it difficult for you to make your payments, because before you had difficulty making payments, you'd have difficulty paying your employees and running the services that you need to run. And so they basically looked at the top line and said, if you cover your debt payment by more than 200%, like if you have more than 2 times coverage, that's AAA in our book. And especially with the broad economic base, Utah Transit Authority is very fortunate to operate in one of the most robust financial and economic environments in the country, where you've had continued growth over a number of years. And so we benefit from the stability and from the growth and the diversity of the economy that is the footprint where you offer service. Moody's typically has offered ratings that were more difficult, or they took a kind of a more stressed approach than Standard & Poor's. And the reason they did that is they'd say, well, yes, your pledge is your top line debts or your top line sales tax, but you have to operate the system. So we're going to run everything through the machine. We'll look at the bottom and see how much you have remaining to pay debt after you've met all of the obligations. Even though we know we have a gross lien on the revenues, you still have to operate your system. And so typically over time, 15 years ago, we only had a Moody's and Standard & Poor's rating. And so there was a big gap between the two, where Standard & Poor's gave you a AAA and Moody's gave you a AA2. So there is a 2-notch difference between those two ratings. And then Fitch was one that was added about 8 years ago, because we figured that would be somebody who would kind of bridge the gap. And also because you were of such a significant size and such a frequent participant in the bond issuance marketplace, that it made sense for you to have 3 ratings, because because there were billions of dollars. I mean, so you have $2.1 billion worth of bonds outstanding right now, but you also have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of other bonds that you have already refinanced, but they can't be paid off yet. So there are escrow accounts set up to pay those bonds off. They're not on your books anymore. They don't have to be featured in your audit or anything like that. They are no longer your obligation, but you have bondholders who still own them and will continue to receive payments on them for the next 3, 4, 5 years, depending on when they were issued. And so your name is well known in the marketplace, and so that's why it made sense to have 3 ratings. Fitch did a recalibration of how they approach municipal bond ratings, particularly for transportation credits. And so think about how interesting this is. You have a AA rating on both your subordinated and senior bonds from Fitch. And at the time that we received that, which was a significant upgrade to your subordinated bonds, they had first indicated, we think we're going to have to downgrade your senior bonds. And after some conversations with them, they came back with a very kind of unique perspective that they were going to upgrade the subordinated bonds a couple of notches and put them on the same level as your senior bonds. So the senior bonds have a 2 times coverage requirement. The subordinated bonds have only a 1.2 times coverage requirement, but they rate them identically, which doesn't make complete sense to us, but we're grateful because it helps the rates on your subordinated debt to feature a AA rating there, along with the higher category A ratings on Moody's and S&P.
Brian, the rating agencies, it looks like they use the same rating process, meaning the letter grade process. Is that that's just an industry standard?
Yes, Moody's. So Fitch and S&P, their numbers are identical, the way they market. Moody's wanted to be a little different, and so instead of using pluses and minuses, they use 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So like an A1 rating is like identical to an A+ rating from S&P, and then a AA2 is identical to a AA rating, and a AA3 would be a lower category rating, or a AA- equivalent. Okay. But yeah, they use those uniform standards, and so those are the ratings, and it's been great to always be able to indicate that we take a careful interest in trying to maintain or see improvement in the bond ratings. A decade ago, when you were issuing debt at below your senior coverage, when you didn't have enough coverage to issue senior bonds, there were discussions with the board and with Ken Montague at the time about the fact that here's where you are. If you issue this amount of debt right now to fund these projects that everybody's telling you need to do, this is what will happen to your coverage levels, and this is what might happen to your bond ratings. And so those were discussions that were had 10, 15 years ago, and generally the outcome of those discussions was that the board ended up feeling that their stakeholders were letting them know they wanted those projects to move forward. And so there was a time period where Standard & Poor's put that AAA rating on negative watch in 2008, and then in 2000, or actually it was in 2011, and then 2012, they took it off negative watch and returned it to stable. So you can see there, the Standard & Poor's, over the years, the credit rating agencies periodically will look at the way they do their analysis, and they might make some adjustments or changes. When Fitch upgraded your subordinate debt to AA and made both of those senior and subordinate bonds the same, that was due to a change in the way they approached the criterion. So they, for their part, they were going to say, we are going to give you an issuer rating, and whatever that issuer rating is, you cannot have a rating above that. And we originally thought that their issuer rating for UTA was going to be a high A, an A+, which meant that your senior bonds would have been downgraded significantly. And talking with them, they decided to make your issuer rating a AA, which meant that no bond you had could be rated above AA, but under their own criteria, which if your issuer rating as a standalone had been higher, your senior bonds would have been higher. But because you hit that cap that they had of AA, both of your senior and subordinate bonds were rated AA under their new criteria. And again, that doesn't make sense from a mathematical perspective or from an economic perspective to think is the risk identical on these two senior and subordinate bonds, but that's the way they've chosen to rate them, and that's their option to do as they will with their analysis. It is interesting that they don't talk to each other. They don't look at what each other rates. So if we're ever speaking with them and we say, hey, Moody's, S&P rates us a AAA, you're rating us a AA, let's put a little pressure on you. They really don't care what the other credit rating agencies are doing. They very much stick to their own independence and their own work and their own models and mathematical analysis that they do to arrive at their ratings. A couple of years ago as well, Moody's did a wholesale review of the way they approached municipal credits versus corporate credits, because if you had in the financial crisis, you had a lot of AAA corporate credits that went out of business completely. They just disappeared. And so you think, well, how could a AAA corporation, how could it be rated AAA if there's a chance it could disappear? Whereas with our municipal entities, there's no chance you disappear. You can, if you stopped running your transit agency, there would still be sales taxes collected that would pay for the bonds. If a city was unable to make payments one year, they can increase taxes and assess taxes. There are legal mechanisms in place that require them to make those payments. And so what Moody's did is they looked at all of the ratings they had for municipalities and essentially wholesale upgraded all of the cities and counties that they rated and all of the school districts. And so they all got 1 to 2 notch upgrades for doing nothing. They hadn't changed anything. It was just Moody's had changed their approach. And so they were looking at municipal entities in a more favorable light than they previously had, and everybody got rating upgrades. We're here to talk today about the fact that Standard & Poor's has recently done a large analysis of the way they looked at priority lien tax revenue debt, and the common parlance for that would be something like UTA, where you're backed by you run an organization that doesn't really have anything to do with sales taxes, but you have a priority lien backing on your bonds that comes from a source that is different than what your actual operations are. And so they looked at this, and as they prepared their analysis and they sent out the criteria for industry people like us and transit agencies and bond councils and underwriters to look at and provide feedback on, the feedback they received was, this is going to hit transit agencies really, really hard. Because of the different operations that our cities run and our counties and different sorts of and water districts and things like that, a lot of those cash flow pretty well, but they use some outside operational support from taxes like the sales tax. In a transit agency's criteria, sometimes they operate for free and they receive actually no income from any of the things they do. In the Utah Transit Authority's case, you receive about 20% fare box recovery, meaning for every dollar you spend on service, about 20 cents of that gets paid back through the fare box. Well, so the rest of that revenue and the rest of that support comes from federal sources, but a lot of it comes from the sales tax. And so as they looked at this, we had conversations with Standard & Poor's at the beginning of last year on this to let them know of our concerns. And then we met with a number of underwriters who'd done analysis on what the possible impacts might be. I think we had one underwriter suggest you could be downgraded as much as 4 notches to an A+. And over the last year, Standard & Poor's released last November actually a kind of a frequently asked questions. They said, okay, well, if you're a transit agency and if you have low fare box recovery, does that mean you're going to get just absolutely hammered on your rating? And the feedback that they give is that they're mitigating circumstances based on the strength of the sales tax credit that you have and based on other factors that they look at. We now believe that, so this has been implemented by Standard & Poor's, and they are in the process of going back and reviewing all of the sales tax credits that fall under this category. They have not reviewed UTA's credit yet. So when they call us and they say, hey, listen, we need to do a review of UTA's credit, we will understand that they're in the process and that subsequently there could be a rating action that might be negative, that could be a downgrade of this AAA rating. We now feel that the likelihood is that rather than being downgraded 4 notches, we think that the most likely scenario is that you're downgraded 1 notch. So you would go from a AAA to a AA plus. So that rating would still be higher than your Moody's and your Fitch rating, and it would still be a significantly strong rating. We believe there is some chance that they might not downgrade you. But I think that the idea was that we wanted to come in and have a conversation just so that you were aware, and so that as you met with stakeholders and other people, that you could understand that that was something that was possibly coming down the road, so that when it happened, we could just say, yep, nothing at UTA has changed at all. Our coverage continues to improve. Our sales taxes continue to go up. We continue to be a well-managed organization. But S&P changed their criteria, and thus we were downgraded 1 notch. If that doesn't, come out to be what the outcome is, which is not certain at this time.
What's the difference in the interest rate if we're downgraded 1?
Well, it would be slight, and the reason it would be slight is that with your split rating, where 2 of the ratings are already at the AA category and 1 is at the AAA category, we would have indicated that bond investors typically will price you as low as poorly as they can. If they have a chance to earn extra money, then they'll earn extra money, and so we would have said that you were not getting the full benefit of being of AAA pricing anyway, because your other 2 ratings are both AA. And so the fact that your AAA rating that was above the AA ratings is now a AA plus rating that's still above those 2 AA ratings that you have on the other side, we would think that it would be microscopic, if any, maybe 1 or 2 basis points at the most.
Brian, does that affect, is there any variable rate that affects in our current issuance, or just would affect a future issuance?
Yeah, it would just be for any future bonds. I guess that is something that we didn't point out when we talked about kind of all of your existing debt. You have no variable rate debt. All of the bonds that you have are completely fixed rate, and so you know exactly what your payments are every 6 months for each one of those bonds until they are redeemed. And so it would only impact new bond issuance down the road.
But can I ask one other question? So what circumstance, I was trying to think through myself all the government experiences where this sort of notion that you don't control your thing. I think of a lot of folks like that get service districts that get property tax. They don't really control development. So do they get downgraded? Or, that revenue source, really only municipalities for the most part.
Yep.
Because even school districts really don't control property development. But they're subject to it. So I'm just wondering if, first of all, are there any other sort of general government entities who are kind of experiencing that same aspect? And then I guess the question is, you may not know this since they're not your clients, but are other transit agencies likely to take a bigger drop, and for what reasons would they take a bigger drop than potentially a point or 2?
Well, I would say that a lot of the fear, and one of the good things about the message today is that a lot of the fear of because S&P actually published, here's what the criteria are going to be, and so we're a category 3 on this metric and a category 5 on this metric, and you can go and see kind of where you think your organization stands up, and that's where a lot of the fear came in. But subsequently, there have been 4 transit agencies that have been rated. One of them was a new rating, so they didn't have an existing rating before. 2 of them had their ratings actually affirmed, and one of them actually had a rating upgrade. And so the fear is that some of the larger entities were at risk. But again, if we'd had this conversation a year ago, we would have had more dire things to say than we do now, based on their final criteria and the clarifications that they've offered subsequent to issuing the final criteria. In Utah, this is the transit district is probably the number one entity that faces risk. Most of our cities seem to be they're so broad and diverse, and they have so many different mechanisms that they can raise, that if they can't raise a sales tax, because it's a priority lien, but it's a limited lien, because you do not have the ability to increase. If you look like you're coming in short on the budget in a year, you can't say, well, we'll just jack up the sales tax another 0.25%. You have the ability to increase your fares, but that is a double-edged sword that sometimes does not lead to higher revenues just because you increase the fares. And so those are the considerations you have. And so they understand the limitations of your revenue flexibility relative to a city or a county that has any number of fees and things that they can increase that are not as elastic as fare box recovery is.
Brian, I just had a question. So just to kind of understand this, S&P has been going through this process of trying to reestablish their own individual criteria for quite a while. And then, like you said, initially, you said that it would have been a lot more of a dire report, but now that they're doing this, are they literally going through every transit agency and treating it as treating it as a separate criteria than what they had originally said? Is that kind of what they're doing? Is
Yes.
They're refining everything?
Yep. So once they published in October, this is our new criteria, because over a year ago they put out, here is a proposed criteria, we're soliciting feedback. And so then they received all kinds of input, left it open for comment so that agencies could voice their opinions and say, hey, look, this looks really draconian, or this looks very difficult, or this doesn't recognize this aspect of our organization that will unfairly punish us. Since October, they've then just started going through. For instance, I work with Summit County, and Summit County received a call saying, hey, we need to look at your sales tax bonds. And so they're going to apply this criteria to Summit County sales tax bonds, which is slightly different criteria than they'd used before. I don't anticipate that it will impact Summit County, but we wanted to have the conversation here because we think there is a chance that it could. And it would seem when Fitch was indicating that they were going to downgrade your senior lien bonds, and the analyst said, oh, don't worry, I'll put in the press release that nothing negative has changed with UTA. It's just our own criteria. I said, I don't think that the newspaper would see it that way. There'd be and so we were relieved and fortunate that did not take place at that time. But we just wanted to have the discussion now, because if you're having the discussion with people already that it's something that could possibly happen, it just puts it in proper context. So if it actually did happen, you could say, hey, this thing we told you about, here it is, it happened. And everything that the rating agencies are saying about the way the organization is run, the improvements that have happened on sales tax, the increasing coverage, the fact that there is no gigantic capital plan right now that we're trying to swallow, which is kind of like the boa constrictor digesting an elephant. Was the 2000s in trying to fund all those projects and get it all done with decreasing sales taxes. But a public demand for the projects from both the board and the stakeholders. So that puts you in a better position now than you were then. And so it would just seem prudent to kind of, have the discussion and have it out there. And then if it happens, if we don't get downgraded, if they come out and say, hey, we've AAA rating, then we say, hey, that's great. We're happy that happened and happy that no action was taken, but wanted to raise the awareness that it is a possibility that you could face a downgrade on that AAA rating from Standard & Poor's.
Do you know of a timeline that they have to implement any of the changes, or is it kind of fluid?
It's fluid. They're going through. They're busy doing current ratings. So entities that come to them, if you were going to issue a couple $100 million right now, you would get the rating update right now because they'd have to look at it for your current bond issuance. But so they're dealing with current bond issuances, and then as they have time, they're looking at other entities that are not currently issuing but have outstanding ratings from Standard & Poor's that they need to look at. I've tried several times from our rating contacts to kind of get them to give me some input about what they think that timeline might look like, and they have not provided that.
Is that your last slide? I didn't want to conclude. Any other questions for either Brian or Bob? I would just say thank you for the presentation. It gave us some great background. I think each of us are trying to understand this component of the agency better, and we'll wait and see. I guess the reassuring thing, it doesn't affect any current issuance. And I guess as we go forward, if there's opportunities, we'll have to evaluate it at that point, whether there's any serious challenge, but it doesn't appear that it should keep us awake at night anyway.
No, yeah. No, I would not think so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Brian. We'll go next to 2019, our performance targets for our executive team. And maybe before I turn a little time over to Steve and others, some background. As we look as a board and how we're measuring how the agency is doing, we're exploring, and it's early in the process, of what kinds of performance targets would be measurements that would be both meaningful, not only internally but externally. I think as we have conversations and with our advisory board and others about where the agency is going, and being able to provide for the public how we're doing, and also just to have it be a vehicle in which we kind of reality check ourselves, that maybe you see early warning signs of challenges. We'd love to think that the way we're performing transit today is the way we'll perform it 30 years from now. And I don't think, we don't know that answer yet. We'll see it probably evolve. I have little doubt that whatever corridors and systems we have in place can either be upgraded or modified to what those future needs will be. But as we look at trends and changes in how people do or don't use the system, I just think back to, and this makes, before I had white hair, when I went to the University of Utah, the discussion was, well, this is a commuter campus. And in fact, I think late 80s, 90s, a lot of the students didn't even live close to campus. And now you watch and drive up 4 South and some of the surrounding areas, and there's more people living closer to campus than I would have ever imagined. And it's amazing. They're getting there, and the parking lots that once where we park now have new buildings, and their needs have evolved. And I remember when Bernie Manchin made sort of the stake in the ground, no new parking lots, and as we were building that university leg, and the university made a pretty significant commitment in regards to their student faculty. So as I look at these performance targets, this is a work in process, and I think as we have dialogue with Steve and his executive team about what those targets are, we're going to figure out together what would be meaningful measurements, and as opposed to looking at them in a punitive way, I hope they lead us to dialogue that, what can we make improvements, or what things are working well and what things aren't, and just have conversations around that end. So, Steve, I don't know if you're helping to lead this conversation, or if there's others that you want to present on this particular aspect.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I'd ask the executive team to come up and sit at the table, so at least somebody's there for you to look at. But I think you've set the table well. I think the one thing I could guarantee is that transit service and how we think about it today is not how we're going to think about it tomorrow. There is a lot of change. Just look at the past few years, the changes we've made, looking at first and last mile, the opportunity to connect with other providers and other modes, the apps that we've developed, the fair pay strategies that we've developed, those are all going to make changes. I think you as the board, as you've spent time meeting with different departments, touring the agency, reading the financial documents and that, you've already made some comments about the dashboards and how we can present this information. Can we, as you mentioned, Chair, dig deeper and provide more information about ridership on our website and allow people to drill down and see for themselves how specific routes are doing. As we talk about our Service Choices initiative that we're going into this year, we're going to look at coverage versus ridership type choices on routes and areas of our community, and the parameters, the measurement tools we use for those different routes will be different based on the type of choices that the communities and we make about those services. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for some good discussion about where we're headed, where we've been in the past with performance targets. You've seen some of that documented in the budget document and in the financial dashboard. But I think the team and I would like to hear from the board about any specifics or ideas. And as you mentioned, Chair, we'll continue to evolve with this discussion, get back to you probably in February with some more ideas based on your feedback.
Any thoughts? Oh, sorry, Steve. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's it. I was just going to turn it back to you.
Just from either Beth or Ken, any thoughts as the team here looks at some of those targets? Of any thoughts about things you'd like to see, thoughts you've had? I'm probably catching a little bit cold, but you've probably also had some thoughts as you've looked at things. And, yeah.
Well, I would really like to focus in on ridership. I'd like to understand ridership a little better. I noticed on the last dashboard that we saw, the ridership was cumulative, and that doesn't tell me anything. What I would like to see is monthly, by the three basic modes of transportation, bus, light rail, and front runner. Where are we each month in those ridership? I can add those numbers up to figure out what the totals are. But the only way to improve that is to understand. In my idea is the only way to improve is to understand where the ridership is this month versus last year on a particular mode of transportation. So I'd like to see that ridership scale changed a little bit to emphasize the three individual modes of transportation.
If I can just respond to that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, we do have that, and I think to your comment, we do show it cumulatively also, but we have it by mode, we have it by business unit, and to Nicole's point that she'll probably bring up, we have it by route. And so we have it broken down, and I think that is the emphasis to what level do you want it, to what level do we want the public to have it. We're not holding any cards behind a curtain. We have all that information. We're happy to share.
Well, I understand that you've got all that, but what I would like to see is that on that dashboard, that one page that we see.
It's on the financial, yes. The ridership is on the financial,
Yeah,
yes, sir.
Just totals, not by route, not by, broken down. I've seen that as well. But I'd like to see emphasis on the ridership. How many people boarded the buses in January of this year, and then February and so forth? Maybe even a 15-month schedule, so that we see January this year versus January last year, and see it over 15 months, so we can kind of get a feel for the trends.
Yes, sir. Yep.
So can I add to to Dave, because we're working together, our two teams, in thinking about where we're going with service choices, as Steve spoke about. We are looking at how that looks externally, and we've heard this feedback from you all about how can we drill down just a little bit on the ridership and actually communicate that to our public. I think what we're looking at right now aligns definitely with Trustee Millington's comment, and we'll also be looking at, as we do our service choices, what are our goals around those individual routes or those modes. And so to your point, how do we compare that to the targets that we're trying to reach? So we're working on that currently, our two teams, planning and our Jonathan Yip's team, our evaluation and analyst team, on breaking this down and then making it digestible for the community, in the sense of, as Steve said, why are these routes rated a certain way, and then making it visual externally as well as internally. So we can look at that and then see what reports come out of that to present to the trustees.
I also think along that line, and thanks, Nicole, I do think that, whatever that vehicle is, I think you want to look at it in an aggregate way that Ken speaks about, but I think we also want to make it available. Hopefully it's not really a lot more work, and because it's using the same data. But we have conversations with local elected officials who say, why don't you run bus, route so-and-so through this neighborhood, and
right.
Those kind of things. And which is definitely their right to ask the question. I'd love to be able to say, without a lot of effort, well, here, let's drill down and see where it's going. And then you can have a conversation with them, he or she, what is it that is happening in your community that would either help or is making this more challenging, and as I realize the planners really go through this question, but sometimes I think if we can also go through it with the elected official, what kinds of things either could you do to help it, or are we going down in essence the wrong street? We've got one bus right now that we can go through your community, but are we going down the right route for the areas that you've created or zoned that would be more conducive to transit? I just think anything along that line that would help a community sort of understand what's going on, would be helpful, at least as we're looking and designing things. Having it be drillable will not only help us internally, but I think ultimately would help others.
I will say our SMART team, Jonathan Yips, are looking at how we can do that, how far we can drill down, and then what information is dynamic and what information would be static, and then how we aggregate it. What we'll do after they tell us, here's the parameters in which the information come from, my team will look at how can we present it so elected official, or just, Jane can get on there and see, well, why is this route empty? Or why is this route full at this time all the time? And so we can see, well, that's because it's on its way back from a full bus, or it's on its way to empty out because of the commuter time. So I think that's what we'll be looking at from that lens of how do we communicate the right message to the public on what we're doing with our routes and our ridership.
No question.
Thanks, Chair. So one of the things that that I kind of feel has some real value and impact long term is a greater integration with our stakeholders and our partners in this. And one of the things that I have always felt is that the information that you're talking about that's utilizable, like whether it's the routes or whether it's different components to that, if we can get that information and engage our partners so that they understand, okay, so right now this particular route can carry X amount of people and it goes down this type of road and these are the times. But what about communities that are developing and that they're still growing and they're having these other types of impacts? And so one street that we might utilize, and this is kind of along what Carlton was saying, that what can we do to connect with that at the planning stage so that there is a greater opportunity for us to go, yeah, this is not just a UDOT type of, connection. This is also a UTA. This is also a transit situation. There's a lot of discussion about TOD and how impactful that it can be, not just at our current routes, whether it's commuter rail or tracks, but it's also our bus routes, our UVXs, and other types of things that we want to implement. And having that, I think that there has been this kind of like dialogue that hasn't always included our stakeholders in a significant way. And that level of input is going to be, that's capturing those, the Jane, if you will, that you just referenced, that the individual who doesn't understand what's going on and can't communicate that, or says, why does this always happen? That's where I think the real push needs to be, is that greater connection and the I don't want to say that it should be overly simplified, but at the same time, I need to say, here's data, here's where you can get it, and here's how you can utilize it. Because we are truly a partner in a lot of these communities, and we need to be able to say, yes, we've heard you, and here's what we can do. So,
Thank you.
One other place I was thinking, and Eddie, hopefully this like triggers joy in your heart, but is on the maintenance side. You know, if I have somebody that I really like and respect, I teach them how to tell the age of the bus by looking at the number. Once they start doing that, they curse me like a month later, and they say, you know, every time I look at a bus, I now know what age the bus is. And I've totally ruined their visual experience. But you know, as we went and saw and you know, watched some of your teams and how they're working on buses and trying to continue them, I think it would be helpful for, especially where we've got heavy capital investments, to somehow track how different types of vehicles are doing, you know, both, especially as you're looking at reinvesting and remodeling those or renovating them, and looking at sort of length of service. Because frankly, if we have a dog bus that is just bad, and you know, that the driver just wants to take on its last run and just park it out in a scrap field, we should make that really clear. I think not only to the manufacturer, but, you know, help us know, like, this is, you know, we just made a mistake on this bus. We should not really buy this bus again, or not go down this road. And yet these buses are worth putting, you know, $50,000 into extending their life a few years. And I think as we have some of that capital investment discussion on equipment, I think that'll be helpful. You know, I don't know that the public will wildly look at that, but we ought to make that out there. And you know, I think occasionally we get into conversations with legislators, and they're wondering about the cost of this, or, you know, why does a vehicle cost $3 or $4 million? And you know, they're probably not looking at it over a 40-year life. And they're probably not looking at, you know, what would be a comparable, you know, vehicle that, you know, a city might use that's maybe a couple $100,000, but it's only good for 10 years. And I mean, anyway, I just think that there's some aspects about how we renovate that could be interesting, and hopefully really important internally as we have discussions. But as long as we're using those for our discussions, if we can integrate this into this outward-facing aspect, and if somebody really wants to get into that thing, let them drill down to their heart's content. I'd love to somehow get there if we could.
Yeah, and we can. We have that data. Those are things we look at, as we shared with you when you toured some of the maintenance facilities. That's an exercise we recently completed, where we actually went through during the budgeting process, looked at each one of our fleet types, you know, and of course we had all the maintenance managers in the room looking at maintenance records, looking at, you know, how often do these vehicles road call, you know, how much are we spending on parts, you know, all of those items that lead to the determination of whether this is a good bus or a bad bus, right? And we went through that exercise. So we have that data. The part that will need to be done is just putting that information in a consumable format so we can give it to you on one page and say, this is how we look at the different fleet types and what it means.
I've even wondered, and maybe I'm overthinking this a little bit, but I've even wondered, would it guide us in what we use to acquire? As we've had like a a Trax train or something that was damaged, but it was bought with FTA money, we, have this obligation to have it and associated for a long period of time. And, are those restrictions, if you're going to have those kind of restrictions, would you want the flexibility of just putting those dollars into something that is unquestionably worth renovating and doing, and then maybe putting our local dollars into something that gives you more flexibility? And I don't know if those are real barriers or I just misunderstood that aspect, but I think you'd think about that a little bit on that aspect. The other thing I was also thinking about, Nicole, and I know we've talked about like who's writing the system, what's, both demographics and, destination and origins kinds of things, and this combination of first mile, last mile, I think it would help the conversation. I know as communities plan, if they could figure out who's writing our system and where they're going and coming from, it would be pretty powerful information, both to the development community, I think, especially as they look at transit-oriented development. But I think it would also help if our ridership is literally dying, or if this is really taking off and our strongest growth segment is, hopefully, ideally, a younger generation.
To your point, Trustee Christensen, we're looking at that. What is the definition of a rider and our stakeholders, right? So the customer experience team will be kind of diving in that. We have an onboard survey, which really gets to our modes and gets information from the public as a whole. And then we'll be looking at, with the marketing team, to really think about how do we take those kind of information and put it into an actual program where we show all the services that we offer in programs. So getting those analytics, understanding the demographics, seeing where those levers go. Do we need to push more on dependent riders? Do we need to push more on commuters? Where is it that we're losing the connection and that information? So we have 3 or 4 surveys this year that are going to help add into that information, and then be able to take those analytics and have the customer experience team say, well, here's where we can actually get some low-hanging fruit and promote more either on our pass programs or a van pool or our service, right? When we come back and talk to you about our service choices, we're not making the right connections for our right people, or we're doing really well in this area. We need to really promote it more. We're not promoting the right service to our community. So we need to take that information and work through that this year to have a comprehensive program to that point. So thank you for that feedback.
And I just wanted to kind of, when you mentioned that, you kind of triggered a thought in my head that, I know we've been doing an annual survey, and I think it's going right now.
Yes.
And it's kind of like it's a broad perspective and kind of trying to develop what it is. Since you mentioned that there's multiple surveys, I think that having that information, are we asking the right questions?
That's a good question.
In these surveys, or are we, maybe there's an opportunity to take a look and say, this might have been applicable 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, but maybe now we need to be asking a different question. So my suggestion would be to kind of say, in addition to the survey data, which we all think the data is incredibly valuable because it does help, we're making decisions on all of this data, but let's make sure we're asking questions that are going to be applicable to today. So
that's very helpful. And to your point, I think you've mentioned that before, Trustee Holbrook, and we heard you. We're looking at integrating a new analytics where we would look at our impressions and looking at how we're getting our social media, and a new kind of information data source as well, so that we can cross-check it with that. So I think we're hearing your feedback on that piece, and to make sure that we're not missing gaps and making sure we're keeping pace with technology and all the other things that are happening. But I think that's something new we need to incorporate this year, so thank you.
Yes, I think it's important that we keep track of our equipment and understand the maintenance requests. But I also think that a performance measure that would be important to me is what's the turnover in our operators? the equipment, to this point in technology, the equipment doesn't operate itself. So I would be interested in where are we with our operators, specifically the older, more mature, and very well-trained operators. What's the possibility of having to, what's the turnover rate among them that we have to fill as they get to retirement age? And I'd like to see some kind of performance that says, here's the turnover in operators, here's the number of operators. Are we able to recruit to replace these experienced operators in a time when there's very low unemployment? I'd like to see some, I'm not quite sure what the measure would be, but something along that line, because that's a very critical component of what we do.
Yes, thank you, Trustee Millington. Just for a little update on that, that is something we haven't had on our regular, dashboard as many people metrics, and it has been something that my office has been working on this past year to really better understand our developing and attracting and sustaining a workforce that we can continue to keep in the future. We do have quite a few retirements, as you're well aware, based on some of the discussions we had last week. And so that turnover information is currently being gathered, and we can certainly work on creating the right type of measure to make sure that our efforts today are to help us evaluate whether our efforts today are sufficient for maintaining our workforce as we move forward.
I think we ought to come up with some measure and then refine it over a period of time.
I appreciate that.
I'd like to see something early on.
Great.
And we may change it over time to be more meaningful, but at least something that that starts us thinking about the very critical component of operate this machinery.
Yes, I appreciate that. So we will definitely work on creating a benchmark performance measure this year.
I think along that same line, Kim, and I think you kind of alluded to it, but I think we'd want to also look at, are we recruiting from, if you take a cross segment of our service area, are we, recruiting across a broad spectrum of the workforce? Do we have how's our diversity mix going, the male, female recruiting effort, and are there challenges to doing? I know that some positions just historically have been male, but are there barriers? Are there barriers to education and training? I love the idea of the apprentice training program that you've worked on and the things, and maybe there's something similar where we see a need to balance something out. Plus, we have the actual workforce need. On top of that, is there something that we might look at strategically long term that points out? And anyway, and sometimes you don't like to. You get, I hate to use the green. Well, I don't hate it. Green, yellow, and red thing. And sometimes you see a red thing, and you're like, I don't know. Can we just show the yellow and the green stuff? But you've got to have the conversation and sort of own up to it, and hopefully we'll have to self-discipline ourselves. Like, it's not our place to chew a head off when we get into a red, but say, well, where do we go? What resources do we need? What changes do we have to think about that gets us to a yellow, or ideally to a green? So I'd like to think about that, and I think I see this again as an evolving thing, and as Ken just sort of pointed out, as we have a measurement, as we have a way to do something, let's just bring it forward. It's going to look a little inconsistent, meaning you're going to be spotty across, but as we add stuff and as things become available, as we figure out how to capture that data, we can just add it and have it be an evolving thing. I don't think we necessarily have to have some big rollout of all of a sudden, wow, it's all done and it's all complete. Because I think once you start doing a few, you think there's an easier way to capture this, and we'll make this improvement. And so sometimes it's good just to try a couple of things and figure how it's going.
I'd like to see something too in terms of incident security, accident reports, or something like that that captures injuries to our employees, incidents that include, even if it's not injury to our employees, what's the accident rate? What's happening in terms of incidents? I'm starting to get these text messages during the day and all night long about, there's a car stuck over the track and at this particular location. I'm starting to see those things, and so I'm aware that they occur with some frequency. And I'd like to see just a summary report that says, during the past month, we had so many incidents. There were so many injuries. We don't need the detail, just some numbers to kind of focus in on what's going on. I'd like to see something like that.
Will do. We have that. We'll provide that information. As Nicole just passed over, we do have a number of avoidable accidents that is on the public website. So that's always an incident or an evaluation that we conduct after we have an incident is, were we at fault or was somebody else at fault? And the other thing that we instituted, as you alluded to, is there are a lot of incidents and accidents that happen on our system that we're not involved with, but it causes a delay. 2-car accident that's blocking the rail. So we modified our emergency reports. And we warned you were going to be handling a lot of these. So, yeah.
Yes, you did.
Yes, sir.
And I am. So the system is working.
Okay. Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry, just one more quick comment, just along those lines too. One of the things that I know, we were at one of our facilities in Meadowbrook, and just learning the simple things that are accident related, that are incidental, but yet we cover those costs. I heard the statistic, and if I'm incorrect, let's let me know, but we lose 360 arms on our train crossings every year from all of our locations. And that's something that, obviously tied to safety a little bit, because these are people that are clearly in a situation where the arm technically would have won because it was already down, but we're still losing that. And those costs and understanding that, I think is valuable in terms of how that certainly that can be created as a greater public awareness campaign in some, some facets, which I think would only be enhanced with what we're already doing. So that's just something else I think would be of value to those incidental things. Yeah, yes, there was an accident at this particular location, but here's what else is impacted that we are covering.
Other costs to our system, and as you alluded, this is very much a public information outreach, because we're not breaking the gate arms. It is the other traveling public that is doing that. And so it is a public information, and yes, we'll do.
Thank you.
Maybe, unless there's anything else, let me just maybe wrap it up and say, you all probably have some things like, I've been wanting to track this, or I would love for you to understand this concept. And so don't think of this as a one-way combination. And you may help us understand something for future discussion by including some performance measurement that is meaningful for your respective areas or observations you've made. So I hope you'll consider this a dual dialogue between us and as a team looking at those. And so we certainly welcome any recommendations you might have. Well, if there aren't any other discussions, and as I mentioned to Steve yesterday, I don't want to put an artificial target there, but we'd love to start with something, as Ken pointed out, and Beth, just as you have stuff and you're able to come forward with some things, that there might be some easy wins. Let's start with those, and again have this be an ongoing process. So great, thank you so much for your efforts today. We just have one resolution in regards to readopting of the 2019 budget. I'll entertain a motion. Any discussion?
Well, in as much as I'm the reason that we're having to reapprove this, I would make a motion that we readopt the 2019 budget that was originally approved in December of 2018. That we, I move that we reapprove the budget for 2019.
Okay.
And I second.
We'll go to a roll call.
Trustee Millington?
Aye.
Trustee Holbrook?
Aye.
Chair Christensen?
Aye.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Great.
Gee, what a surprise.
Yeah. If there are no other business before us, our next meeting will be on February the 6th, and I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
We stand adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Steve, for joining us.
Thank you. See you next week.
Okay. All right. So I just did second.